Hello, I'm Cory Burnell, and I'll be your host for this episode of Inside View. Thank you for joining us again. And once again, we have the privilege of having our U.S. representative in Congress, Tom McClintock, with us here for this episode. So we're going to get some answers to a lot of questions about what's going on in politics around the country and in Washington, D.C. So, Congressman, thank you for joining us again.
Cory, again, thanks for having me.
You bet. Well, boy, there's so much going on, and I know that the viewers of this show and of our channel here are pretty well informed as far as, or in tune, we might say, with what's going on politically. Mm-hmm. Two topics we'd like to cover on this episode would be the international trade talks that the White House is having, and tariffs that are being threatened, if not actually imposed, and then also we'll cover immigration policies and you know, what's happening there with sanctuary cities and perhaps the border wall. And then, of course, we have the upcoming midterm elections. So we'll kind of dive in with some of our questions and get your thoughts. I know they'll be very valuable, as always.
Well, thank you.
Well, President Trump is talking so much about lousy trade deals that have been created or made over decades here, and he's attempting to fix some of them. So what's your take? Do we actually have lousy trade deals like he suggests, and are there some you would see that ought to be fixed?
Well, I don't share all of his views on trade, I'll tell you that. And I do have to give him credit for some remarkable progress on rolling back the regulatory burdens and the taxes that had crushed our economy during the Obama years. We never had a year that exceeded 3% revenue growth. That was the first time since the Great Depression that's happened during an administration. The stories that we were getting about regulatory burdens basically just snuffing out American commerce. We had the highest corporate tax rate in the industrialized world. It was killing us competitively nationally. President Trump and the Congress, through both legislative and regulatory administrative action, has rolled back the regulatory burdens. It's a bigger regulatory relief than we saw during the Reagan years. And at the same time, we just were able to win the biggest one of the biggest tax cuts in American history. It's meant an average of $1,900 less taxes for every family in this district, according to the House Ways and Means Committee. That means every family in the district, on average, now has $1,900 more to spend in local shops to attend to their own needs. And when we cut the taxes, guess what happened to our revenues? They've grown. Right. And in the first 9 months of this fiscal year, we've actually seen an increase in revenues despite the major tax reductions. That's how big the economic expansion has been that's being driven by the regulatory and tax relief. So that's all extremely good news. And you've seen the economic data, where it now looks like we're going to be on track for 3.1% revenue growth this year, or pardon, revenue growth, economic growth this year. That is right up there with a booming economy. We have the lowest African American and Hispanic unemployment rates that have ever been recorded. Consumer confidence is, I believe it is now a 17-year high. So that's all working. But it worries me that a trade war could suppress or snuff out that economic recovery, because we tried there's nothing new about these policies. They've been tried for hundreds and hundreds of years. Thomas Jefferson thought that we could finance the entire federal government and protect our fledgling manufacturing sector by high tariffs. Right. And instead it produced one of the worst recessions in the history of this country. When they had the recession of 1929, Herbert Hoover tried that again with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. It was a steep tariff on about 20,000 imported products. It's widely blamed for turning the recession of 1929 into the depression of the 1930s. So we know what happens when you start raising tariffs. It destroys the economy. I thought Larry Kudlow and Arthur Laffer made a very good point in the Wall Street Journal a few months ago. They put it this way. They said, look, if we really want to screw over another country, one that we really hate, like Iran, without actually going to war, what do? We impose economic sanctions. Well, what are economic sanctions? Yeah. They're impediments to that country's ability to import products. What are tariffs? They are impediments to our country's ability to import products. Why would we do to ourselves something that we only reserve for our worst enemies? Bastiat made a similar point 150 years ago. Like I said, nothing new in these policies. He began by asking in his essays on free trade, what's better, abundance or scarcity? And this is not a trick question. Mm-hmm. We all know instantly the answer to it, but don't believe for a second that that's being translated into our protectionist policies, because these tariffs take abundance and they turn them into scarcity. Mm-hmm. If we can buy widgets from Canada for $1 each, and yet it costs us $2 to manufacture them here, what you'll hear is protectionists saying, we have to level the playing field. We have to add $1 tariff to the widgets that we're bringing in from Canada. Well, now, what have you just done with that? You have just cut your widget supply in half. You have taken abundance and turned it into scarcity. And Bastiat also pointed out, look at all of these enormous amounts of money and labor that we put into doing things like digging tunnels through canals, building railway bridges across great chasms, building trans-Atlantic ships and all of the harbors that are required to support them. Why do we do all of that? For one reason: to overcome the obstacles that nature has placed in the path of our ability to trade with others far away. Why, having surmounted all of those natural obstacles to trade, would we then impose artificial obstacles to trade like tariffs? It makes no sense at all, and yet, through the centuries, we never seem to learn our lessons. So that's what worries me about a trade war. Now, I can tell you this. A group of about 20 of us congressmen met with Larry Kudlow, who's the chief economic advisor now to the president, who is an ardent free trader, and Peter Navarro, who's his protectionist alter ego. They told us that this administration has three overarching trade objectives: zero tariffs, zero non-tariff barriers, and zero subsidies. That is the very definition of free trade. And if that's and it seems to be working. That week, the European Union had come to the table and said, "Okay, let's talk about truly free trade." So if that's their objective, I guess I'm going to cut them a little slack on how we get there, although it does make me very, very nervous. But it seems to be working, and as long as that's where they're heading, that's good news for America, that's good news for every one of our trading partners, and it's good news for the world economy.
Yeah, and there's been that speculation that perhaps this tough talk from the White House is essentially to get people to the table to have a discussion, and so, yeah, it sounds like
that is certainly what Kudlow and Navarro implied to us. So I don't quite get it. It's like putting a gun to your head and saying, "Don't move or I'll shoot the hostage." But but it seems to be working.
Well, you alluded to kind of us not learning our lessons with regard to trade over the years, kind of imposing barriers to it.
We don't learn a lot of our lessons in politics.
In all sorts of things.
I mean, we make the same mistakes over and over again. In the physical sciences, if we make a discovery, we learn from it, we incorporate it into our body of knowledge, we build on it and progress.
Right.
In politics and political science, we seem to make the same mistakes over and over and over again, and it drives me crazy, because we have all of history to look at what policies work and what policies don't work. Those are the lab notes of civilization, and very little of what we debate here is new. As I said, the arguments I just quoted from Bastiat were made 150 years ago to exactly the same debate that we're having today.
Right.
Why don't we learn from our mistakes, learn from our successes, abandon our mistakes, and move forward with our successes? I wish I had the answer to that question.
Well, and similarly, I don't think we learn our lessons on immigration either.
No.
And, what we see, I guess, there are motives to protectionism. If you're in a particular industry, you want yourself protected. And, of course, you elect somebody to office to pass a law in order to get yourself protected, right? And there are motives to immigration law, whether perhaps it's labor and you don't want competitive, cheaper labor to come into the country. And Perhaps it's political in that some immigrants vote a certain way. So if you're in that particular party, you may perhaps be less restrictive to immigration. So, yeah, can you speak to some of the things that need to happen on the immigration front and address the motives behind
getting back
immigration
to policies that work and policies that don't work? I mean, history is screaming this warning at us. Countries that either cannot or will not defend their borders simply aren't around very long. And that's the question that we are having today. I mean, there is a strong movement on the left to open our borders. Our country's built on immigration. And that's a very important concept. How do you do that? How do you create one great nation from all the nations of the world? It's through assimilation. That's the process by which, as someone comes to our country, they come with a sincere desire to become Americans. They come because they understand our Constitution, our philosophy of governance, and love that philosophy. They come here because they want to see their children succeed and prosper as Americans. Our immigration laws weren't written to keep people out. Our immigration laws were written to assure that as people come to our country, they assimilate into America. And that's why illegal immigration is so lethally damaging to a country built of legal immigration. If you're going to tolerate illegal immigration, then there's no point to legal immigration, and that whole process of assimilation breaks down. That's the great threat to our country, and I think it's one of the three mortal perils that our country faces today.
Well, isn't it, or I guess I shouldn't pose it that way, but is it a legitimate criticism of Democratic immigration policy that they will call for amnesty, and they'll call for sanctuary cities and sanctuary states, essentially violation of federal law, the lack of enforcement of it, rather than lobby for changing or fixing the law? If there's something they don't like about it, why isn't there any discussion going on about modifying immigration law?
Because their position appears to be quite comfortable with simply not enforcing immigration law. Well, if we're not going to enforce immigration law, then our borders mean precisely nothing.
Sure.
And we've just made a mockery of the millions of legal immigrants who've obeyed all of our laws, who've waited patiently in line, who've done everything our country's asked of them to do, while millions of illegal immigrants cut in line in front of them. It's not right, and it's ultimately self-destructive to any country. And you look at a country like Mexico, they have very, very severe immigration laws, and they actually enforce those laws.
Right. Yeah, as most countries do.
Well, exactly.
And have the right to do so.
Because if they don't enforce them, they're no longer countries. And if we don't enforce ours, we're no longer a country in the conventional sense. We're simply a vast open territory between Mexico and Canada.
Yeah, and when it comes to the lack of enforcement, the Democrats just deciding not to enforce them at all. I mean, we have a situation where we just pick and choose which laws we're going to enforce. Why have immigration law at all? In fact, what has become so it's been actually become controversial in this country to enforce the law. You see the left and the news media make controversy out of the fact that the executive branch of the government is actually enforcing existing immigration law.
And that kind of attitude is absolutely lethal to a country that is based on the rule of law. Lincoln once said, if the best way to repeal a bad law is to enforce it. And he gave a very, very remarkable speech when he was 28 years old in Springfield. And the speech was entitled On the Perpetuation of Our Political Institutions. And one of the central points that he made is there is no grievance that is fit object for redress by a mob. A law is either a good law and ought to be supported by all men and women of goodwill in the country and enforced, or it's a bad law and should be changed by the legal process afforded us. But in neither case should a law be subject to mob rule. And that's said and ignored. That was the the basis of his message there in the 1830s when he gave that speech. And that's what I find most shocking about this so-called sanctuary movement. What they're actually doing is invoking a discredited doctrine that dates back to the actually before the Confederacy, but it was the central legal doctrine of the Southern Confederacy, and that is that if a state doesn't like federal law, it's perfectly free to ignore it.
Sure, nullification.
Well, nullification is right. It's called the doctrine of nullification. It first reared its ugly head actually at the end of the Washington administration.
Well, yeah, 1798.
Oddly enough, on tariff issues.
Yeah.
And ultimately became the legal doctrine behind the Southern Confederacy.
Yeah,
it's been thoroughly discredited since then because, again, you cannot have a federal union such as ours, a constitutional republic, in the presence of that doctrine. Washington understood that, and Andrew Jackson understood that, Abraham Lincoln understood that theory of nullification is absolutely lethal to a constitutional republic. The two cannot coexist. And yet that is precisely the doctrine that the left is using to invoke these so-called sanctuary policies. And people have to understand exactly what's going on. Federal law requires that if you have an illegal immigrant who commits another crime and is jailed for that crime, when they've served their time and are about to be released, the Immigration Customs Agency has to be notified, this is federal law, so that they can come and take custody of that illegal immigrant to see that they are deported. That's very, very important because in the jail setting, that criminal is disarmed and is in custody. Once that criminal is released back into our communities, ICE has to go and track them down. And that is a very dangerous proposition,
Sure.
both for law enforcement as well as for innocent bystanders. And the Orange County Sheriff's Department recently released figures on the number of criminals who have been released under California sanctuary policy that have then been rearrested for felony crimes. This is a very dangerous thing to our public safety, and yet it is being pursued with reckless abandon by the Democrats in Sacramento and in the cities that they control in this state, and it's frightening. Well,
and are there any solutions being attempted here by the federal government, perhaps the executive branch?
Well, I think ultimately the Supreme Court is going to, this is all being litigated now, and I believe the Supreme Court ultimately will weigh in with the obvious conclusion that, the Supremacy Clause of the federal Constitution says that those laws that are within the enumerated powers of Congress, and immigration is one of those enumerated powers, are the supreme law of the land and must be respected by the states. That's about as clear as you can get in the Constitution. Again, it's the foundation of a constitutional republic. Without that concept, we don't have a federal union. We don't have a republic. So ultimately, I think it's going to be there's going to be an edict handed down by the Supreme Court on that subject. Now, what these recalcitrant leftist cities and states do with that is we will have to see. If they resist that, then they're crossing a very bright line, which hopefully we won't get to.
Right. Yeah, the doctrine of nullification, of course, I believe was originally espoused by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And, of course, the idea that they laid out there was laws that are in violation of the U.S. Constitution. Here, with the sanctuary policies...
it was taken to an extreme by John C. Calhoun.
Sure, over tariff issues, which then Andrew Jackson had to intercede.
Exactly right. And Jackson basically he threatened to hang the state officials who were defying federal law.
Right.
The big controversy was in Charleston, and he threatened to send warships to Charleston to hang the perpetrators of this
Well,
doctrine.
and as I recall, the tariff certainly was in pursuance of the constitutionally authorized powers of the federal government.
Exactly right. That's another of the enumerated powers of
as is
Congress
immigration.
is tariffs. Yeah.
So here you have nullification of something that is obviously within the purview of the federal government's authority.
Yeah. It's the very same doctrine
right.
the Democratic Party pursued in the pre-Civil War era and that led to the Civil War.
Right. That's right. Well, now, what about one of the campaign issues in the presidential campaign and a border wall? Where are we at with that and funding of it? And you mentioned that, boy, this really was started 22 years ago.
Well, it was authorized 22 years in 1996, and was supposed to have been built then. And actually, portions of it were built. And where it was built, you had a dramatic decline in illegal immigration in those communities. The problem is it was never completed, so you have big gaps in it, and that leads to our current problems. But walls of a similar design have been used by Israel to protect their borders and have proven to be virtually 100% effective. So the question is, are we going to be able to get the funding for the wall? And that still is an open question mark. Some funding has been provided, but it will take the Senate acting on an appropriations bill in order to fulfill that funding. The House, by the way, I believe, has sent funding to the Senate on that subject. The Senate simply won't act because the Senate Republicans refuse to enforce refuse to reform their cloture rule that gives any senator the ability to block a bill they don't like until somebody can come up with 60 votes to get that bill taken up and considered. That is nuts, and that's within the power of Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans to change. They have chosen not to do so, and that is at the heart of much of the dysfunction that we see in the legislative branch. But we talked about that during a previous episode.
Yeah, in fact, I hope our viewers will go look for your previous interviews here on Inside View on YouTube.
I actually did a paper for Hillsdale College.
I recall that.
About, oh my goodness, 3 or 4 years ago now. I'm sure that's on the net, but that'll go into it in great detail. But it is a big problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when it comes, we've got the midterms coming up, obviously. Should there be any change, significant change, can you foresee any significant change in the Senate that might cause the Senate leadership to be altered and changed?
Oh, well, you know what Yogi Berra said about predictions. They're very difficult, especially when they involve the future. So I don't want to try to make political predictions. I think it's a very turbulent time. Obviously, history is against the Republicans. The midterm election of a new presidential term is usually the majority party usually loses seats. But there are so many cross currents right now. It's very hard for me to predict. First of all, I think the polling that we've seen nationally that was so wrong in 2016 is understating Republican support. The economic expansion that we're undergoing right now, I think people are feeling that in their lives and are, I think, going to be very positively inclined to answer the question that Ronald Reagan asked you, better off today than you were 4 years ago. I think most people are going to say, yeah, I am. And then the next question is, well, would you like to continue those policies or go back to the policies that brought us 8 years of economic stagnation under Barack Obama?
Right.
And I think that is going to be self-evident to a lot of folks when it comes time for them to fill out their ballot.
Well, I think the year-over-year GDP growth for the second quarter, just comparing second quarter this year to second quarter of last year, I believe was 4.1%, perhaps 4.2, 4.1.
But as you know, your quarterly numbers will vary rather a lot.
Right.
But what I'm told is we are on pace to hit at least 3.1 economic growth for the full year, which will be the first time that's happened in about 15 years.
That's a phenomenal amount of money on an economy our size. What are we, $12-15 trillion economy, something like that?
Over 20.
Over $20 trillion economy size. So, yeah, when you get percentages like that, people might think, well, 3.1%, something like that. But you were talking off of $20 trillion. Is tremendous.
And don't forget, that's the economic growth that we've got on the business tax side. But there's also enormous economic growth on the personal income tax side. If you're an average family in this district, as a result of our tax reform, you now have $1,900 more to spend. Your federal tax burden is dropped by $1,900. You're probably seeing that in the lower payroll taxes that you've been paying since the first of the year. If you don't, you'll certainly see it next year when you start to fill out your income tax forms. But I think people, when you have that big tax relief, people feel that. They feel the fact that the opportunities are abounding, and that their finances aren't quite as tight as they were. That's ultimately, all of these economic statistics that we throw around really don't mean much. What means everything is what a person is feeling in their own lives. And from all the feedback I've gotten, clearly people are feeling that the economy is growing, their opportunities are expanding, their security is greater, and they're feeling it in their lives.
Right.
And there's no way you can spin that. Any politician that tries to spin that looks foolish. People know what's going on in their own lives, and if you try to tell them otherwise,
that's
good luck.
Good point. Yeah. Well, to wrap up the issue of immigration and the border wall, it oftentimes gets spun as though being for the wall is being anti-immigration. And you mentioned Israel having a wall that's essentially protected them and prevented illegal immigration. And yet we have trouble, I think Republicans have trouble squaring that debate up, that we're not anti-immigration, anti-illegal immigration. The wall helps with legal immigration. So can you speak to why some of the motives for Democrats in that they're actually pro-illegal immigration? If they were pro-immigration,
I just told you,
the law?
I can't tell fortunes, but another of my limitations is I can't read minds.
Okay, darn it.
So I'll let their policies speak for themselves. But illegal immigration clearly undermines that ingredient that produces a one great nation from all the nations of the world. It undermines the process of assimilation. And once you've done that, you remove the glue that holds together our country as one great nation. I've often pointed out, in the American view, really there's only one race here. It's the American race.
That's right.
We might be all different colors, but there's one race. We are Americans. And that is the product of assimilation, that people come here because they love our country, they love our Constitution, they love the sentiments of the Declaration of Independence, and they want to become Americans. They want to adopt American culture and American traditions, adopt our common language, English, and raise their children that way. And that's why we have our immigration laws, to assure that the people who are coming to our country are coming with the intention to assimilate into our society. Illegal immigration undermines and destroys all of that.
Yeah, that's a fantastic note to wrap up that topic on. And so in our remaining couple of minutes, I want to make sure that our viewers are aware of your website, tommcclintock.com, and that you're running for re-election in November. Of course, there's the House website. That's house.
No, it's McClintock.house.gov.
McClintock.house.gov.
I'm sure it'll pop up.
Pretty quickly, yeah, I'm sure. And so please do visit the Congressman's website and get to see the issues he's talking about there. There's an issues page, and then I suppose you probably have events posted there, perhaps, where you might be doing
campaign
speaking.
event. On the campaign
events.
side, we do.
Okay. And that's at tommcclintock.com, is it? Lastly, if you folks have enjoyed this show and would like to share the Congressman's interview with other folks that you know, it's going to be uploaded on YouTube, and so you can search some of the Congressman's interviews with us on youtube.com, and then forward those on to friends and family that you think would be interesting in hearing from Congressman McClintock. So thank you very much again for joining
Cory,
us.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure each time.
Same here.
And thank you, too, for joining us on this episode of Inside View.